All right, welcome back to the final part of stratification, where we're going to talk more about global stratification and inequalities on a global reach than so much so on the individual, which we've talked about, and how we are stratified based upon class, based upon race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. But now we're going to start looking about how this trickles into the world around us. So first things and foremost, we look at the idea of global stratification and inequity. Essentially, this looks at comparing wealth and economic stability and status and power of status of powerful countries. So that sounds pretty self-explanatory when you think about it as towards like, what is a powerful nation? What is not a powerful nation? How does these nations end up working versus how do they benefit us in the long run? And essentially, when we look at the various countries around the world, we do see similar dynamics of categorization that we do with people in society. It's still broken down and it's almost the same story, different day, right? We start placing certain nations above other nations as towards their prestige, income, and production, and what they bring to the table. And these global nations have an unequal distribution of power, us being the United States, one of the core nations, compared to a semi-peripheral nation, such as some of the countries with some of the locations, thinking about like if what's going on with Ukraine and how would have been handled differently if this had been a core nation that was being impacted and all that good stuff, right? So what you're starting to really see is this dynamicism of how core nations, or the ones who are seen as historically were called first world nations, which had a negative connotation and was shifted, versus the semi-peripheral and peripheral. Are the nations industrialized? Are they bringing equity to things around them? Unequal developments and wealth various in nations, right? When we categorize nations, we're not too quick to make the leap and had cultural and technological lag towards the ones who have been able to have much more industrialization and much more global reach as towards the powers they've had, and the countries who have taken advantage, like us with colonization, of going places to take the natural resources and benefit ourselves as opposed to the other nations. So pulling to that, right, just go back to our slide 1 second here. We're looking at core nations versus peripheral nations, wealth within various nations, playing applicable, global stratification and inequity. Essentially, Volk Rostov believed that what could be viewed as trickle-down or top-down modernization, that it was done in 5 stages. You're looking at a traditional society with limited technologies, it says here, preconditional for takeoff commercial exploitation of agricultural and extractive industry, okay? And then we have the takeoff. This one takes the longest of all of them because we're trying to get from, you're at that stage of industrialization, but will you be able to be takeoff to be a core nation? We're seeing a lot of this with the different joining of the UN, countries that were seen as not or likely to be a part of the core nations. But what you're looking at is traditional societies, agriculturally based economies, preconditioned for takeoff, which is manufacturing in nations and international focus takeoff. The industrialization begins to occur. We start to see them maturating and having more equitable donations towards the global scale. And Rostov's principle essentially argued that some places have developed in progression more towards others than shown by just their global domestic product or the GDP. The belief of Rostov's view is that nations were poor or rich in some stages in development of developmental sequence, right? Thus, with access to obtain resources, control and development is possible for all. However, this is not always given. That's the key word there. It's not always given. Essentially, what you're seeing is that there are limitations, and we do not allow certain countries to be able to get to the high mass consumption period because the core nations want to maintain the balance of power. Looking back to Marxist social conflict theory, right? The haves and the have-nots, and wanting to make sure the distribution is not benefiting all, but is benefiting only some. So just like typical human behavior, those with means of production have taken advantage of those of control without the means of production. Thus, the core nations have made the semi-peripheral nations no longer be able to maintain their wealth, going in, seizing oil, making sure that we take advantage of the resources that we want. This is talked about in conflict theory, as I was mentioning, massively. This can also be viewed as dependence theory, or a theory which states that the global inequality is due to the exploitative nature of the peripheral or semi-peripheral nations by the core nations. Or as this slide is talking about here, you can look at it here. The stronger and more industrialized nations took advantage of the weaker nations to obtain unequal numbers of resources, simply put on that slide for you. Patterns of global stratification show trends to understand resource consumption and production within the nation. If you were a poor, this is a great example here, right? If you're poor in the US, it's not the same, or Europe, it's not the same as if you were in a semi-peripheral nation, if you were in one of the locations in Africa, for example, right? These less industrialized nations have a different vantage point or reference group, as we've been talking about, of what wealth is understood of. So reference groups of understanding become a big deal. Are you going to be able to depend upon yourself? If your friend's making 60K and you're making 80K, right? If they're making $100 million of profit, we're making $1 billion. That is the dependency that we take advantage of them to maintain our wealth. Understanding the comparison if you are poor in Europe is important, but also understand that economies are judged based on the GNP, the gross national product, or the GDP, the gross domestic product. Essentially an outdated and less favorable term for the countries that you may or may not have you may or may not know better since I've been using the definition of what we've changed it to. It was first world, second world, and third world countries. This was changed based on the negative association or stigma that would be given to someone who's from a semi-peripheral, peripheral nation being called a third world country. We start thinking them as less than, and we don't want to impose this type of labeling on people, right? So we changed it to core nation, semi-peripheral, and peripheral. And it's important to know these terms here for the gross GNP, right? The GNO is the estimate of the total value of all the final products and services turned out in each period by the means of production. And the GDP, which many of you probably heard of a million times right now with our current economy. This is how much we produce, and which makes you a large economy or not. Calculate this by adding up the output inside the borders of the country. This determines how wealthy a country is seen. Are you an oil-bearing country or are you a grain-bearing country? Interesting dynamic of this is how this can all play out, right? So I don't know if any of you are car people, but Porsche, major manufacturer, very luxury car, right? Doesn't have an idea right now, and maybe it's changed since I was looking into this, of how are they going to distribute certain models of their vehicle, because parts of their manufacturing process was maintained in the Ukraine. And so because of this nation's conflict and what's happening, the Ukraine development couldn't proceed, thus making the unequitable distribution of resources problematic, because now the luxuries are being impacted by the unfortunate realities of the situation. Thus, you see the impact it can have on resources and the control of said resources, because even here in a core nation, our limitations on being able to have distribution are based as such because we do not have access. This is a funny TikTok if you're willing to watch it on your own time, making a joke about how lumber skyrocketed during 2020 and people just looking at trees like they were money banks. But absolute poverty, a state where one is barely or unable to afford necessities. Think of the images of the children of African nations who sniff glue not to be hungry, or the people living in cardboard boxes in part of India. If you look at the caste systems of the past, it's really important to think of these dynamics. An example I have for you, a kind of anecdotal story. I have a family friend named Charles Mooley. You can look up the Mooley Foundation if you'd like to. He was once a titan in his industry, owned the oil and he owned the production and the means of production. One day, he was a very religious man. He felt called by God to go and help the children. So he started the Mooley Children's Foundation and drove around the streets of Kenya and Nairobi looking for children to take in. Eventually, he had to start turning children away because of how much impact the amount of poverty had impacted this semi-peripheral nation, right? So it wasn't something that he could maintain, unfortunately. So it's important to know these things because these people are out there doing these things, but there's limitations towards how much the country has been impacted by the status of their economic display on the global scale. And some interesting terms for you to know here when we're talking about global stratification and inequality. I'm going to go through these: capital flight, or movement of capital from one nation to another, jobs and resources. This can also be seen as outsourcing. This tends to be a big deal. When we can't make it here at a certain product, we will then find a much cheaper place for taxation and domestic goals to get a higher ROI, or return on investment. This can be capital flight. You start moving your production overseas to lower the price of manufacturing, which then causes the main nation to start losing jobs, and also demonstrates an idea of how the wages won't be that great also, because they're looking to do it at cost. Chattel slavery, a form of slavery which one person owns another. Chattel slavery can be best understood as sold as capital in trade, or when someone is inherited within their own, when their owners dies. You can also look at this as being given instead of currency to pay the debt. I can't pay you, but my son will work until the debt is paid off. This is still done commonly. This is seen in places such as East African countries, such as the Sudan. It's still a thing that happens now. It's a big deal. Another term that I mentioned that hasn't been mentioned in the slide is the feminization of poverty, and can be understood as an example of wages between men and women, which is exacerbated by the income of single mothers and not being able to obtain wealth or income, pulling back to the ability of pulling what is wealth versus what is income, right? Core nations, we talked about this: dominant capitalist countries, debt bondage, an act of people pledging themselves or their servants as an exchange for money or passage. This ties to chattel slavery. A really great video here. If you don't know about debt bondage, please watch this video. I have this on a PDF, so right now you'll be able to see it. But essentially, the act of pledging themselves and servants, the amount of interest you pay on loans and the predatory action of loans for places like Drive Time and these places that pop up during Christmas is when they're out there of having 200 to 300% ROI interest occurred on the loan are predatory. Massive debt occurred to obtain services. So these people will make these things to give a gift of luxury or love to their family and then incur generational levels of debt. Really good video here. Definitely watch if you're interested in watching a real applicable situation that is relevant to now. Some more terms to know about global stratification and inequality. De-industrialization, the loss of industrial production, more commonly due to the peripheral, semi-peripheral nations. So you're on your way, that's the takeoff. And then what happens? Well, you're deindustrialized, right? Now you're in a situation where your country is not able to produce the goods, thus putting them back into the semi-peripheral peripheral stance. First world, old term used for the people who are in capitalist or industrialized societies. It was used in the Cold War era, first world nations. Fourth world, a term that describes stigmatized minority groups who have no choice or voice or representation. You can start seeing why we changed it. Globalization of feminization of poverty, which I just mentioned, a pattern that occurs when women bear the disproportionate percentage of the burden of poverty. This happens globally a lot, especially with different gender norms and other cultures. Really good video here on de-industrialization that I found, if you're interested. Definitely worth watching. The loss of industrial production, commonly due to the peripheral or semi-peripheral nations. Some more terms you know. I mentioned this, gross national income. Modernization theory, a theory that low-income countries can improve their global economic standings by industrializing the infrastructure and shift to cultural attitude towards work. So we need to make money. Well, let's make our culture about money instead of like tradition or family or values, right? So what you start seeing is this dynamicism of getting yourself modernized so your country can grow. And then you have peripheral nations, we mentioned this, semi-peripheral nations, we mentioned this, I'm not going to drag it onto you. Relative poverty, being able to evaluate your situation like a reference group, the state of poverty where one isn't able to live a lifestyle of the average person in the country. So you can look at the idea of, am I poor or am I poor just here, right? So in a global stance, am I poor in America versus am I poor in Africa? Or am I poor in versus like India, right? So the relative poverty of a country based upon the construction of what is wealth seen as the GDP and GNI, right? Subject poverty, a state of poverty composed of many dimensions, subjectively presents one's actual income does not meet one's expectations, right? So it's subjective, like Thomas theorem. So we have an idea of what we're supposed to be and what we're not supposed to be within a global scale. Being wealthy in America versus being wealthy overseas, it can be based upon subjective realities. And then this is a really good one I want to kind of emphasize here, underground economies. This is relevant to right now with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, an unregulated economy of labor and goods and that operates outside the governance, regulatory systems, or human protections. So there we go, human protections. When you take away something, it doesn't mean it goes away. This works both globally and locally when we're talking about stratification. It just means that the protected way that it's being manufactured or being distributed is no longer regulated. Thus, when you get rid of something, an underground economy occurs. Think about prohibition, right? Alcohol was still sold, it was just sold illegally. Think about Roe v. Wade being overturned. Abortions are still going to happen in red states. They're going to happen more dangerously. It's about the underground economy and no longer being regulated through systems of currency or capitalist drives that are able to protect it from being manipulated. I'm sure many of you can think of some examples of some more underground economies. Fun fact for you, during the pandemic, in the midst of lockdowns, right? Gyms were an underground economy. They shut them down for safety regulations. But what happened is that places were on a if you know, you know basis, double charging how expensive it was to come to the gym to open their services at night so that people could come there and work out because they had to and they really wanted to. So you take away a service, it doesn't mean it goes away. It means it becomes deregulated, which means it can be very, very dangerous because it can become predatory and it become not even taking the consumer into thought. But yeah, global economy, the concentration of resources in certain nations impacts individuals in poor and less powerful countries. So what do we see here, right? The wealth that we see and what we experience is not what other countries see. So you start seeing the impact that has. Thinking about Moody driving around trying to take care of children. He might have an easier job in the United States, but the reality is that in some areas, it's just so destitute that the global economy is not going to be able, and the global inequality is not going to allow for impoverished nations to be able to prosper like the prosperous ones, right? The unequal amount of production in peripheral and semi-peripheral nations compared to the core nations, because a lot of it is manipulation, right? Expands the relative poverty and subjective poverty. This is what happens when we start being able to experience what is wealth in these nations. The Genie Coefficient is really important. Incomes inequality based on countries using a 100-point scale. 1 represents complete equality. 100 represents the highest possible inequality. In 2007, in the southern parts of the world, they were at 75.5. Just let that sit in. 75.5 inequality. And this is what we're talking about in modern day, not in some other time. So when you talk about this lack of equality, it's there, right? It's there. Functionalist perspective, pulling to global, right? Different aspects of society exist because they serve a purpose. Why do certain countries have more access to resources than others? How do race and gender play into global inequalities? Functionalists believe all parts of society have a purpose to better the parts around them. How can this be true? So these are the kind of pulling at that, right? If functionalism, it's functional because it gives countries something to aspire to. Is this fact or cap, right? Is it motivation? Motivation to encourage competition, right? If this is the reality, this pulls back to the idea of the Davis-Moore thesis, right? If it's equitable, is it equitable? Not sure. But this is the idea functionalists would look at it. Does this serve a purpose? Is it functioning society to maintain society? Conflict theory, critical of global stratification, just like they are of class stratification, right? Asserting that it only benefits some nations, the core nations, not all. Core nations have the access and take the access from the peripheral nations, means of production, same story, different spin, right? Alienate the worker and process, alienate the countries, make them feel less than. Vast inequalities within the global stratification system. Some benefit more than others. False consciousness, class consciousness, believing that the nations are here to help us when really they're taking the resources, pretending to protect us. Socially and globally, the ability to lose from those or worse positioning becomes utilized, those both on the global scale and the group-based. He who controls the spice controls the world still holds the same thing. He who controls the salt, right? And then you have the interactionalist perspective, which is extremely important, right? Global stratification is why many people who share similar passions, hobbies, and income, racial categories, views tend to be surrounded by one another. People want to be around each other. It's the same story again. Built-in systems of stratification, group cultures put together, royalty marrying commoners. These are all the same kind of constructs, but put into the sense that global and class can be seen similarly. So we see a lot of people wanting to maintain their culture, their norms, their values, their traditions, even if it puts them in a place of inequitable situations, because the connection to the symbols and the micro and the interactions of each other really plays into how we see the world around us, our clothing, our traditions, our choices, our community. It ties together, like Sharkey showed, with those making less money, still living in lower income areas. This applies globally as well. But this is a little shorter one. I hope it's shorter. I kind of went a little tangents here, but as always, keep up to work on your coursework. Make sure you're posting on Yellowdig. And the reality is that you just need to make sure you're always questioning, always asking the questions and looking at how the impacts of stratification can be seen globally, domestically, and how these systems of inequalities and these systems of categorization are at play at all times. What is your socioeconomic status? What is your family experience? What are some thoughts you have on how you distribute wealth? Share these things on Yellowdig, talk about it. Looking at the systems at play, how have you benefited or how have you not benefited? Let's all talk about it. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. We'll talk about race and ethnicity next. I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next lecture.